Welcome to Trail Talk. I'm your host, Aaron Shimmons. Thanks for coming back to our Global Ultra Trail show. This week, we have a very lengthy conversation with Ian Corless, who I'm not sure if many of you will know, but Ian has been a journalist, a photographer, a reporter, a pundit, a voice in ultra and trail for longer than I've been in the sport. He's someone that helped me learn about the names, the personalities, the races, alongside things like Salomon TV. So his influence on the sport as it grew from 2012 through 2019, let's say, was just really important. I've just finished recording the conversation and we touched on so many things. Let's call it the State of the Sport episode, from UTMB and Skyrunning and Golden Trail and doping and Killian Jornet and so many other things that it's just a fascinating conversation and great to have 2 hours of Ian's time just to chew the fat on the sport, a sport that we both love. So please stick around and let us know what you think of the episode. Before we get there, a couple of shout outs for the sponsors. Swiss Canyon Trails. The Trail Talk meetup is at the end of May. There are 40 or 50 community members racing between 16 and 111 kilometers. We're all going to be there. Come and race. Come and have the crack with Ricky and I. It's going to be so much fun. Trail Talk 20 is a discount code if you want to enter one of the races. Also, we have a couple of other sponsors, Tantrums and XMiles, discount links in the description. And also CurraNZ, the New Zealand Blackberry supplement, also have a discount available for those as well. Check them out. That's how we run the show. Without further delay, let's roll the interview with Ian. Ian Corless, welcome to Trail Talk. I feel really pleased and happy that you're taking the request to come on the show. I've been hounding you for a long time to come on the show. I've known of you since I got into ultra running and trail running back sort of 2012 through 2014, thinking about the Skyrunning days in the UK, thinking to the Glencoe Skyline and the Maxwells. And that's kind of whenever I was starting to cut my teeth. And back then you were already you were the voice that people listened to. It was the podcast that people listened to. I'm not sure if there were any other podcasts about, certainly in Europe. So look, welcome to Trail Talk. I'm really happy to be chatting with you.
It's awesome to be here. Thank you. And apologies that it's taken me so long to find the time to be here. You know, when you do podcasts yourself, and admittedly, I don't do podcasts very often anymore, but like, do you want to do a podcast? And it's like, well, yeah, but then finding the time. Anyway, I found the time, a little bit of downtime, and it's really good to be here. And you've just made me feel old.
Well, I mean, I hope that wasn't the intention.
No, I know it wasn't.
You don't look a few years older than me and nothing more. And sure, look at me. I'm a spring chicken.
Yeah. Well, I said that your hair is looking beautiful, and if I'd have known, I'd have done something with mine. You know, I'm used to podcasts where people don't see me. You know, many people used to say, Ian, are you going to do video as well? No, nobody needs to see my face when I do a podcast. Audio is perfectly fine.
Those days are now gone, but
exactly.
Let's start off there, because Talk Ultra was, I mean, I think the last episode you released was maybe back in September of last year. Sporadic releases, but that was the go-to place for learn what was happening in trail and ultra running from someone that was actually at the events as well. Like, you were traveling the world, still are, photographing these iconic races, and you know all of the athletes that we have up in these pedestals, like the greats. So talk a bit about Talk Ultra, its evolution, and why we don't see it anymore.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you. I am very, very proud of Talk Ultra. I think it was something very pivotal in the sport, and I think it's really nice when somebody like yourself says, back then, you were really the only one. I wasn't. but certainly there was not many. And it came about primarily because I was an advertising commercial photographer, and always have been. You know, I've been a photographer for over 40 years. And my passion, my hobby was sport. I progressed through cycling ranks to elite, and then I went into triathlon and did Ironman, and then in 2008, I did a thing called 8 in 8 in 8, which was 8 marathons in 8 days in 2000. And I liked the ring of 080808. That was inspired by Dean Canazes. You know, I read his book and I thought, cool, this guy's like mental. He's like crazy. And his book and him running stupid distances, I just thought, this is like stupid. And I'd come to the end, or I was coming to the end of Ironman. You know, I'd started doing Ironman as a hobby. And of course, the OCD part of me, once I start doing something, it becomes like, no, that's it. You're doing Ironman now. So like, I was meant to be doing less time in sport because cycling was very, very time consuming. And I ended up doing 3 sports and creating even a worse scenario. So anyway, in 2008, I thought, you know what, let's try this like marathon day after day. And at the time I was like a 250 marathon runner. So I was in good shape, and I am absolutely nowhere near that now. And I ran the Thames Path, which worked out beautifully as 7 marathons. And then on the last day, I ran London Marathon. So I ran basically to the start of London Marathon and then did London Marathon. And this wasn't about FKTs. In fact, actually, I don't even think they existed then. It was just about a project. But while I was training for this, my dad got cancer. And my dad was going to be my crew. We'd got sponsorship from a mobile home company. He was going to drive, and it feels like that is perfectly normal now. You know, somebody running a marathon a day and a crew waiting, jumping in a mobile home. Like 2008, Dean was doing it, but I don't really know of many other people who was doing it. Anyway, it all became very, very fragile, and my dad obviously couldn't crew. And in the middle of this, he had to go into hospital for an operation. So I ran the marathon. I had a taxi waiting for me who took me up to Liverpool in the northwest of the UK. I was there for my dad's operation. And then the following morning, the taxi took me back so that I could then run the next marathon. And this was the process of thinking about ultra and my connection with sport, because it was a hobby, really. You know, I wasn't professional. And at the same time, my very good friends was doing Marathon Talk podcast, which was one of the first marathon podcasts. Anyway, my dad sadly passed away in 2009. In 2009, my dad passed away. I got divorced, and I folded my photography side of things, and I was left with, you know, one of those years where it is a complete and utter blank canvas. It feels as though at one point your life has almost come to an end. Every aspect of it that you felt you knew ended, and I was left with the space. And I had this, and pardon the language, fuck it. I am going to try and just do what I want to do. And that is basically how I ended up doing what I'm doing now. I was a photographer who loved sport, who found ultra running, in inverted commas. And I helped Marathon Talk with some content. So I introduced them to Scott Jurek, and Scott Jurek went on the podcast. I introduced them, I think, to Dean Canazes, and Dean went on the podcast. And then the guys at Marathon Talk said, Ian, you know what? Just do a podcast. And that's how Talk Ultra started. And I'm sorry I've gone on a little bit, but I think it's an important perspective, is that I didn't have this revelation to just do a podcast. It was an organic process of a really, really actually bad time in my life. You know, I can talk about it very, very easily now, but it used to make me very emotional. You know, there was a lot happened in 2009, and I'm almost grateful that I came out the other side of it, because, there was some really dark moments. But the podcast, the community, was so important. And I started the podcast and I went to my first big race, which was Transvulcania in 2012. And the whole reason for me to go to that race was to podcast. And for those who know the sport, Transvulcania in 2012 was the pivotal moment in, I think, this sport. It was when Skyrunning did Less Cloud, More Sky, and they invited all the big ultra runners to Transvulcania to do basically a showcase skyrunning race. And I've got photographs from there, and I look back and I laugh, and I'm sitting at a table with Anton Krupicka, Anna Frost, Killian Jornet, Emily Forsberg, Jeff Rose, Francois Den, and the list goes on. And at that point, I didn't really know who they were, and they didn't know me. And that is what I absolutely love about this sport, is that I had the equivalent of sitting at the table with Messi and Pele, all the best of the best. And we were just chewing the fat, having a crack, drinking, having a laugh. And I just had this is amazing. But then at Transvulcania, I took photos and I wrote about the race. And then somebody said to me, Ian, there's nobody else doing this. You're talking about it, you're writing about it, you're photographing it. And I think Brian Powell at I Run Far was the only really other benchmark. And I had a friend in Australia called Marcus Warner, who was setting up a website at that point. I can't remember what it was called. I think it was Mud, Sweat and Trails, certainly something like that. So there was Marcus in Australia, me in the UK, and Brian Powell. And I think arguably you can say the rest is history.
And not to be forgotten as well, 2008, 2009 was the credit crunch, whenever the financial systems all collapsed. So everything really did go down the plug hole.
Yeah. And certainly, the work that I was doing professionally was impacted by that. But I got preoccupied by being around for my dad, being around for my mum. The business side of things just basically drifted away. And also my marriage was falling apart. So I had a lot to think about in that period. And I think a lot of the times when you come out of the other side of something really, really bad, you can say objectively, you know what, it was actually one of the best things that ever happened to me. And I don't mean that in an awful way. I don't mean getting divorced was a best thing. It wasn't. My dad dying was not the best thing. But all these things forced me. It's mile 90 in 100 miler when you want a DNF and you don't. You do everything you possibly can to continue and come out the other side.
Yeah, you bet on yourself and it worked out.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I was in the fortunate position that I didn't really have anywhere else to go. I didn't have anything else. My attitude was, I'm actually at zero. In fact, in reality, I was probably at negative. I was minus. So if it all goes for shit, what have I got to lose? I mean, it can't really go any worse. So I think out of adversity, there can be some really great positives. You really do get your ass in gear. You are forced. You have no choice to come out the other side and make something happen.
And as Talk Ultra evolved, you were at all of the major races. In fact, I would say, along with you and Salomon TV, that's how I think a lot of people heard about races, heard about athletes. Like Talk Ultra, the website and the podcast was pivotal in spreading the gospel of ultra and trail.
Yeah. And it was a fantastic period. And I say that looking back, and but I also say it in perspective of where I am now. It's still relevant. It's all still very, very pertinent to what is happening in the sport. But 2026 is very different to 2016. I mean, in 2016, I'm just picking that year because it's 10 years, there was me, Brian Powell, and maybe a couple of others. And we were at the top and the reference points. And I would say post-COVID in particular, there's probably a lot of people in COVID that went through what I went through in 2009. COVID was a properly shit time for people. And there was probably a lot of resets and people coming out. You know what? I love ultra running. I love podcasting. I love running with a camera. I've got a phone. And post-COVID is very, very different to pre-COVID. And, there's pluses and minuses to that. But yeah, you're right, is what I was doing in 2015, 2016. In fact, actually, let's say 2012 through to 2020 was really, really important and pivotal to the sport as a reference point and as an information point.
Yeah, so much changed from the pandemic with the amount of people that then got into running. And I think we've all experienced whenever we get into ultra running, it attracts and holds tight those people that are kind of obsessive about the sport, and we just want to do everything, whether okay, well, I am going to do a podcast. I want to, I've run trail race. I want to run UTMB. It's an all-in kind of sport, and just this massive influx of people have meant there's a lot more people trying to go all in on it.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. I've had lots of conversations with people about a second book, so I did a book called Running Beyond, which was basically came about from me going to a lot of races, having a lot of content and writing about them. And Running Beyond was fantastic because it just became this, I call it the divorce book, because so many people would have it at home and a husband or a wife would go, I'm doing that one next. I'm doing that one next. I'm doing that one next. And somewhere down the line, the other person in the relationship would go, hold on a minute. How many races are in this book? So I call it the divorce book. But yeah, I mean, Running Beyond was fantastic. And I've been asked many times, when is Running Beyond 2 coming out? And it's like, we're in a different time. There's so much information out there now that I'm not saying there isn't a place for a Running Beyond 2, but I was more interested in what would be an interesting book visually and literally to look at the sport in a different way. And I don't know if a lot of my podcasts, they always revert to, when I'm interviewing somebody, there is always the backstory. There is always the why they got into the sport, and very often it's midlife crisis, a divorce, the falling down of a business, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and everybody has got that thing. And it's, I wouldn't say 100% of people who are doing ultra running have got a problem in their life somewhere, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's in 90 something percent. And just the OCD part of being an ultra runner is, ultra running does require the person to be of a particular type of demeanor. And so this was part of my thought process of maybe a book that looks into like the craziness of the crazy. But then I started to think about how I would put that together, and I think it just overwhelmed me. But it's still there. It's still tickling in the back of my mind.
Let's talk a little bit about the sport and how it's changed. Skyrunning was the thing. We talk about the Golden Trail World Series, and that has evolved to something that it didn't start off as. But skyrunning, like, it was those epic ridge lines and Killian dancing along them that just like drew us in, and we're like, I need to do that. I need to go to that race. I need to experience Trophy O'Keem, Matterhorn Ultrax, Sierre Zinal, all of these types of races. What's your thoughts on like sky running back then and just what we have as trail running now?
Oh boy.
Big question.
How long have we got? I mean, literally, when you get me talking, this could be a really, really long one. So look, chip in, okay? So first of all, I've got to give a huge thank you to Lorian Marino from Skyrunning. Marino Giacometti created Skyrunning through his own mountaineering passion, and they got me involved in 2012, and then I went with them to every race between, let's say, 2012 and 2020. Maybe not so much in 2020, obviously because of the pandemic, but certainly through to 2019. And I still do some work for the Skyrunning Federation, which is Lorian Marino, because the Skyrunner World Series is now owned by somebody else, not Lorian Marino. So, that's a discussion in itself. But like I said, I was dropped into this world in 2012 in Transvulcania with the best of the best. Killian, I just say Killian and his peers, Dakota Jones, the whole lot. And I got to see them run Transvulcania. And, Transvulcania is one of my favorite courses in the world. It really, really is. But in terms of skyrunning, it has perfect skyrunning ethos in that it starts at the sea, goes to the summit, and then drops back down to the sea. That's pure skyrunning. In terms of technicality, Transvulcania is not that technical. There's no really exposed ridges. There's no real danger, in inverted commas. Then I went to Trophy O'Keem the same year. And it was like, my God. It was like a revelation. I was in a helicopter, hanging out of a helicopter, photographing people running on a vertical wall. And you'll say, well, you can't run on a vertical wall. Yes, you can. There's just metal pegs. And these are not wearing Via Ferrata harnesses and wearing helmets. They're just holding a metal wire on the wall, and they are on a vertical wall stepping on steps. And I'm thinking, this is bonkers. And, I fail to find anybody who gets to witness Trophy O'Keem who would not be not only completely blown away, but thinking, my God, this is the best sport in the world. And it's for such a small few. Trophy O'Keem then was every other year with probably in 2012, it probably only had a maximum participation of around about 150. I think it's increased now to around about 250. But it's a very, very extreme race. And it's not the only one. In Italy, there are countless other very extreme races. And I thought, you know what? This is just incredible, this type of thing. And at the time, 2012 was a real pivotal point, is that Skyrunning wanted to expand. And the whole reason why they invited all these ultra runners to Transvulcania was that they wanted to extend the distance the races would happen over. Skyrunning typically was anything sub 40 kilometers, and it was about altitude and going to the peak and coming back down. And a classic skyrunning race would be around about 20 to 30K. And it still is, I think. I still think that is the perfect sweet spot for a skyrunning race. But of course, people wanted to run further. Trophy O'Keem is actually a long race. You'll have to remind me on the distance, but it's around about 55 or 60K.
Yeah, it's just over 50K, isn't it?
Yeah, which then for skyrunning was a very long race, But the development was, let's find longer races. Transvulcania was obviously around about the 73K mark. And then there was this diversification of the sport, is skyrunning became 3 different disciplines in a way. we had the VK, the classic VK, which I love. I think it's an absolutely fantastic format. There was Sky Race, which was that sub 40K distance, and then the Sky Ultra. And the Skyrunning World Series then was, I still feel, the perfect format. 5 VKs, 5 Sky Races, 5 Ultras. And you could accumulate points and become Skyrunning World Champion as a VK, a Sky Race, or an Ultra. And then there was the combined, where you could have X amount of races in the VK, X amount of races in the Sky, and X amount of races in the Ultra. It was clear in the what was the sport. And the nice thing is that races like Dolomites could have a VK on the Friday and then the Sky Race on the Sunday. So, somebody like Killian could do the VK and the Sky Race. And that was normal. And the good thing was, it was very, very easy for the athletes to look at the beginning of the year and say, okay, well, I'm going to do that VK, that VK, that VK. I'm going to do that Sky Race, and one Ultra. Now, the Skyrunner World Series is God knows how many races. It's like 20.
Yeah, easy.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that they're bad races, but there's too many. And I understand why there's so many, but you reduce the level of competition because obviously the runners can't go to all the races. You cause an issue in planning and travel. Whereas pre-2012, pre-2020, it was really lovely. I can do this one, and this one, and that one, and that one. And they were all amazing races. There was no filling races because we needed to add more to the series. I think it's got a lot better in the Skyrunner World Series, but there was definitely a point where, like, hold on a minute, that's not a skyrunning race. That's just basically a trail race. It's not skyrunning. And I remember with Laurie and Marino, we were looking at a way of trying to communicate to the everyday trail runner what the difference is between trail and sky. Now, the original classification was a sport above 2,000 meters. But as you will know, I introduced Glencoe to the circuit. I introduced the Morns to the Skyrunning UK circuit. And so I had this conversation about, there can be sky races, but they're not at altitude. You come to Norway where I live. I'm not joking. There must be 30,000 sky races here in Norway. I mean, literally every time I go out, this could be a sky race. This could be a sky race. I mean, the country is just full of sky races. And of course, we had Tromsø, which Killian created with Emily. But there's no altitude in high altitude. You're only at 1,000 meters, 1,500 meters, but you can accumulate a lot of vertical. So the definition for skyrunning came about. You need to use your hands. And it's a really simple classification, is that if you run a trail race, how many times do you need to use your hands? You probably don't, do you? There might be one. No, there might be one or two. Wrong. Exactly. There might be one or two exceptions where you might have to put your hand down or grab a rock. But it's skyrunning. Soon as you start going up, you're probably like this, holding rocks. It's where running becomes climbing, almost scrambling, Killian would call it. And of course, we have to take with a pinch of salt how technical a race is if Killian is talking about it, because I've seen a lot of what Killian calls an easy run, and they're not easy. But this was the thing. We had this beautiful sport which had the best in the world taking place from 2012 to 2019. You look at the start lines, you look at the results, and you go, and even now, I looked back not that long ago because somebody asked me a question. And I went, I think it was to Dolomite Sky Race, in Italy. It was very often the season end. So it tended to be quite a big race. And I looked at the results and I went down like the top 20 men and I thought, oh my God, like there's people on this list that then were not that big. but are now huge. And a good example is John Albon. John Albon came from OCR, obstacle course racing, where he was a multiple world champion. He came to Limoni, and it was a perfect fit for him. Obstacle racing, sky racing. And I can't remember where he placed, but he did really, really well. He was definitely in the top 10, maybe even in the top 5. Now look at John Albon. I think he would still say I'm a sky runner, but he's not anymore because the sport has changed. And if you're a pro athlete, you have to go to where your sponsors want you to go, to the races that are going to elevate your profile and the profile of the sponsors. And sadly, post-COVID, skyrunning doesn't have that huge appeal anymore. No disrespect to the athletes that are taking part. There's some absolutely fantastic world-class athletes, but it's not the who's who of the sport that was pre-2020.
Why do you think that skyrunning era ended? Like, was it a case of obviously the athletes were getting older and there's a natural push maybe to go up the distances as well, but it felt like something changed with skyrunning that then the Golden Trail came in?
I think 2018, the alarm bells were ringing about Golden Trails. Okay. And there was definitely conversations about could a new circuit called Golden Trails incorporate skyrunning? And I'm not going to go into the political side of that, but anyway, there was certainly that sort of discussion. And then Golden Trails started, and what was very, very interesting, and I don't know whether this was it, but the Golden Trails series, when it started, was basically a skyrunning circuit. If you think about the original Golden Trails series, it was what was the skyrunning series. Dolomites, Zagama, Pikes Peak, I'm testing my memory now, but I'll just use those 3 as an example. And they were all races that had been or were about to be sponsored by Salomon. And so you have this big machine, Salomon, creating a circuit. And, I don't know what the conversations were, but it could be as simple as saying to Zagama Ascori, oh, yeah, you're in the Skyrunner World Series, but Salomon sponsor you and we're creating a new series and you're going to be part of that. Okay. So the Golden Trail series, when it started, was basically a skyrunning circuit organized by, covered by Salomon and the Golden Trails name. So this created a problem. And then COVID hit. And what Golden Trails did very, very well in COVID was survive. They maintained an element of the circuit. They maintained good PR. And if you notice that the skyrunners that would have been doing skyrunning races couldn't go to skyrunning races because they weren't happening. So they went to Golden Trails. And that was for me, the downfall of what was the Skyrunner World Series. Golden Trails pulled those people, looked after them very, very well, offered prize money. The way that the Golden Trail series worked, I don't know if it's, certainly the circuit has changed now, but, in that 2021, 2022 format, they would take 15 athletes almost around the world and look after them and keep them very, very well. And that would have been those people that were doing skyrunning. And of course, you can't get away from the fact that the big names in the sport, like Killian, like Emily, and I'm sorry I keep saying Killian and Emily, but they are reference points for skyrunning and the sport. And even though, Emily isn't racing very much anymore, everybody still remembers her pre-2020, this beautiful young girl who comes on and starts kicking ass, and it was fantastic for women. It was fantastic for the sport because, this was an ordinary girl inspiring other women to do crazy shit. And I think that the importance of Emily, Anna Frost, and that group of people cannot be underestimated for where the sport is now, and the progression and the growth of females in ultra trail mountain running. And there's still a long way to go, but we are in a considerably better place. And it's those pre-2020 role models, and now Courtney and Katie Scheid and Henrietta Alban are taking over the mantle. But you know, these people pre-2020 still have a voice and still have a resonance in the sport. So, you know, these are very, very complex and difficult things to try and compress into a chat like this, because I literally could talk all day. And I'm sorry that I might be waffling from going from one thing to another, because my mind is jumping and thinking about moments that I experienced. You know, it's like a real nostalgia run.
Yeah. Well, it feels like it was the golden age of the sport.
Yeah.
But like this, where we are now in trail and ultra, that is the foundation that it has grown up from. Thinking to the Skyrunner regional series or the national series and the UK and Ireland series, initially you were initially you were the person behind setting that up in the UK and Ireland, and then it disappeared, and now it's actually come back again in certain respects, and there's a couple of really good races in Ireland now as well.
Yep.
Talk a bit about the Skyrunner national scene and how that kind of exploded and then disappeared.
So basically, I mean, that was like the evolution of the sport. Is we wanted passionate people who wanted to grow the sport, and that was an easy fix for me. You know, I was living in the UK, absolutely loved skyrunning, and I wanted a UK race in the Skyrunning World Series. Brilliant for the UK, brilliant for the sport, knock-on effects. But you had to create a circuit or the races beforehand. And, you know, in the UK, without doubt, within the Lake District and Scotland, there were races, probably fell races, that had real elements of skyrunning. But I knew that I had to create something new, something fresh. And I knew Shane Oley from Aurea Events, because I'd been working on things like Dragon's Back, and Charlie Sproson, who was in the Lake District. And then I got to meet the brothers in Ireland. And I went to them all and I said, right, guys, I want crazy races. And that's it. We basically, I didn't design the races. I informed of the concept of what I wanted. And they went away in their areas and looked at what was possible, and then came back, and we created a bespoke Skyrunner UK and Ireland series, of which the pinnacle was Glencoe Skyline. And Glencoe Skyline is up there with Trophy Okema. I mean, you know, for people who are aware of the sport, they will have heard this last week that Aurea Events, Shane Oley, have ceased trading. It's beyond sad, because this was a really important, pivotal point for the UK, for the world skyrunning circuit. It really was. Glencoe Skyline was an absolutely stunning race, and I feel it's so sad that we might not get that race back ever. And, you know, Greg Volley, who was the Salomon team manager, messaged me and he said, like, this is so bad. Is there anything that we can do? Killian commented, you know, one of the best races I've ever done. Emily Forsberg, Florian Wright. I mean, the list goes on. That I contacted Emily for the first edition. So it's probably 2014 when I contacted her. I said, Emily, can you come over to the UK and run a race for me? And she says, what is it? I said, we've created this like badass sky race in Scotland, and you know, come over and run it for me. And she said, okay, if you say it's going to be really good, I'll come over. Like, think about me doing that now, you know? The conversation would not be that easy, would it? Because, oh, well, I've got a family. I've got to keep this happy. I've got to do that. But then it was like, okay, Ian, if you say it's going to be really good, I'll come over. And I invited Florian Reichert. And we had the local fell runners, mountain runners who came. And like that first edition in 2015, everybody got to the finish line and they went, oh my God. That is the best race I have ever run. And the Scottish media got hold of the fact that this race was going on. And of course, we went up Curved Ridge, which is a grade 3 scramble, I think. And then the Anakiga. Now, the Anakiga is like a properly exposed ridge, you know? And in the copy that we sent out for the race, it says, there is a risk of death. Because literally, if you fell on the Anakiga, it was not going to end well at all. And the Scottish media got hold of this before the race. And I think one journalist, I can't remember whether he called it the Highland Death Race or the Glencoe Death Race. And I said to Shane, you know what? It's not a bad name for a race, is it? And he says, look, I'm not using that as a name. I said, though, yeah, Glencoe Death Race. People would want to come for the Glencoe Death Race. But yeah, we created this event. And then, of course, Shane grew the Glencoe Skyline into Skyline Scotland, where he created more events. We moved the centre to a climbing area. And I guess one of the biggest problems we always had in Scotland was infrastructure. You know, it's not Chamonix. You can't just keep bringing people in. We were always limited in probably every place, you know, whether it was the Lake District, maybe the Mournes in Ireland had a little bit more flexibility. But skyrunning races were never about putting 1,000 people on a mountain. No, I mean, it was about 200 people probably maximum, because they were extreme races and not everybody could do them. You know, so the idea behind the UK circuit and the other circuits that grew around the world was creating events, of which in each country there would be one event that really stood out, that then could be added to the Skyrunner World Series, if so applicable. And of course, we had the World Championships in Scotland, and the Mournes has now re-emerged and is part of the new Skyrunner World Series, which is great. You know, I mean, I think it's so good that things have gone full circle. And I believe Michael Jones is the director now. And
that's right. Yeah.
Michael Jones was the creator of Ultra Trail Snowdonia. So we're in a very small hub of people who all know each other. So it's, you know, it's nice that something like the Mournes has come back with a new race director and fully with the support of the Maxwells. You know, the Maxwell brothers were really, really happy that Michael was going to take it on. There was no conflicts there. And there's part of me that hopes, and I don't know whether as a community of really passionate skyrunners, that we somehow come together and try and bring back Glencoe Skyline, the original route, not the new route, the original route. And even if we had it just once as a showcase for the sport, you know, if we said 2028, we are going to bring back Glencoe Skyline for one day, I reckon I could get Killian, Emily, the whole lot of them to come. I reckon. Because I think the course was so special that they would make the effort far enough in advance so that they can plan for it. We have this weekend, which is a celebration of what that route was. And maybe that would be the catalyst for somebody to take it over and bring it back. But you know, that's my dream, actually. I have this dream that we can bring one day Glencoe Skyline back.
That would be pretty cool. I think like one of the things that stands out to me is how important a scene, a race scene, a community is. Important people that are willing to set up things, put themselves out there, create events, manage events. Like in the times when the Maxwells had the Mourne race, like it was a passion project. It wasn't
exactly.
It wasn't a business venture.
No.
And like mentioning Mike Jones, talking about array events, thinking about like James Ellison, Centurion, like there's only a handful of people that are doing things and making things actually happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've been asked so many times, Ian, will you please organize a race? I go, no chance. No chance. I go to so many races. I see the stress. I see the problems. I see what can go wrong. I'll let other people organize the races. I'm happy to be involved in some way or whatsoever, but I have this really, really low tolerance level for people who tell me racing is too expensive. At the end of the day, racing has to be at a certain price to make it viable. And yes, there may be some races, some race organizers who are charging high prices to make big profits. At the end of the day, it's a business. And we as runners have a choice what races we go to and what we don't go to. If you're pricing a race too high because your only priority is profit, the runners will eventually realize and they'll go away. But with what's happened with Aurea Events, okay, a professional race organizer who employed, I think, 10 people, over 10 years I think it's 15 years in the sport, this is a business. It is a business where you've got to pay salaries, you've got to rent an office, you've got to rent a warehouse to store equipment. And that all is reflected in the price of a race entry. So there's that side of it. James Ellison, Centurion Running, similar thing. Shane Oley, Aurea Events. There's countless other race organizers. They are businesses. Name your price and let the runners choose if they want to run it or not. Don't complain it's expensive. If it's expensive, don't enter it. But that's the way it is, Racing has to be viable. Otherwise, the sport will disappear. And what's happening this week is really important. Last night, Tenerife Blue Trail have cancelled their race weekend. 400 runners no longer have a race this weekend. What is the impact there for each individual runner? What is the impact for UTMB? What is the impact for the race director? It's a force majeure situation, just like COVID, but there is a knock-on effect. How will that impact how people enter races in the future? Aurea Events cease trading. People have been paying entry fees for months. So are we going to see people saying, oh, you know what? I'm going to leave it a little bit before I enter because I'm not committing to something 12 months in advance. And if we're not committing in advance, then the race organizer has less security because he hasn't got the money or the security to start planning, to start financing. So we're in a real catch-22 situation. And then you mentioned the Maxwell brothers in Ireland. It was a passion project. For those two guys, if they could make a little bit of money, fine. But really, all they wanted to do was break even. They didn't want the race to cost them money. And I think for them, there just came this point. They were both married. They both had young families. They both had full-time jobs. Putting on this race, which was a passion project, which took a lot of time, there just comes a point where you go, no matter how much I love this, I think I'm just going to have to call it a day. And there are lots of races that you see one edition, two editions, and then they disappear because the reality is race organization now has to be a business. It has to be, I think, professional. Yes, there can still be low-key races. Like if you go into the UK, into the Lake District, there's probably 2 fell races a week and it costs £10 to enter and you can go for a pie and a pint afterwards. There's not really any great security, medical cover, mountain rescue. These are just turn up, run down a hill, go home. But you go to the Dragon's Back route and you're taking on a 6-day adventure with huge distances involved, mountain rescue, medical safety, infrastructure. It costs. It really does cost. And I think we're in a really important point in the sport where this is being looked at. And of course, we're eventually going to get onto the UTMB beast, I am sure. If UTMB is too expensive, I can't remember what it is, like €450 to enter UTMB now, and the prices drop down. Okay, €450 is expensive for sure. It's not stopping anybody entering, is it? You know, they are still super oversubscribed. And somebody said to me the other day, you know what, they could probably charge 1,000 and people would still go. And I think they're probably right, because there are
in any other industry, isn't that what would happen? You just keep putting the price up until supply and demand.
Yeah, exactly. And at the end of the day, Ironman, the Polettis, they're investing a great amount of money. I think the last time I looked, there is 76 by UTMB races. There's probably another one been added in the last 24 hours. I don't know. But there is a big bill to be paid somewhere. And if we look on homegrown Ultra Trail Snowdonia, I was there in all the early editions with Mike. You know, we were camping in a field in the middle of Wales. That was the event centre. And Mike said, you know, I want this event to become bigger, a pinnacle event. I said, yeah, but I said, it's never going to happen with people camping in a field, you know? It can't be this
That's
small,
only a certain type of demographic.
It has to
that
be
are
a
into
certain
that
thing. And the, you know, always the problem with Ultra Trail Snowdonia was Snowdonia is a small place. There's no real big hub. There's no Chamonix. They've now moved and they have got much more of an infrastructure, but they still have a real issue with hotels, accommodation, transport. But whereas Michael might have been struggling to get 500 runners, as soon as UTMB took it over, it went to 2,000. And I think now it's at 3,000. The UTMB magic, like it or not, has an effect. And, you know, that means that the you know, if you've got, let's take in the UK, you've got Ultra Trail Snowdonia, which is 100, many races, but let's say the pinnacle is the 100 miler, and it becomes this pinnacle event. Lakeland 100, okay? By contrast, it's a race that's been established for many, many years. Mark Laithwaite, the race director, super, super passionate. The course is navigation. Now, admittedly, it's not really navigation because everybody who's doing it probably recces it and knows the route, but it's not marked. And he caps how many runners he can have because of the impact on the environment, impact on the land. Many years ago, pre-COVID, I said to Mark, you know what, Mark? I said, what about if we got Anton Kupichka and Nuria Pikas and, you know, some of these other runners to come to your race? No, mate, not interested. It's not about that. It's about providing a high quality event that I'm happy with and the runners are happy with. And I thought, you know what? Fair play.
Perfect.
Fair play.
Yeah.
You know, he was never bothered about who came to his race. And they've had great runners. Michael Jones won the race and became a race director. There's people who, Beth Pascal won the female race and look what she went on to do. So it was still this catalyst event. You know, the organization, the creation of races filters through. It's a culture. It's a community. But you have to acknowledge that underneath all this, if we want high-profile professional races, there is a business behind it. And I think part of the problem with runners is because you just need a pair of shoes and a pair of shorts and a vest, and you can go out your door, a lot of people really are reluctant to pay too much to go running. And my argument always is, if that's the problem, just go out and run. Glencoe Skyline route is there every single day of the year. You can go and do it whenever you want. But if you want mountain rescue on Curve Ridge, if you want mountain rescue on Anakiga, if you want aid stations, if you want helicopter coverage as support, if you want all this infrastructure, you have to pay.
Yeah. Like one of the things that I've always sort of thought is whenever I was getting into the sport and getting that kind of infatuation with it, I learned about the other races like UTMB and Chamonix. Never heard about it before. West Highland Way, like these classic races, these big events. I heard about them from the old guys in the club. There was no Instagram. There was, I don't know if maybe there was Facebook, but the point is, with the influx of runners post-COVID and the financial capabilities of UTMB and the marketing money, people are skipping these feeder events that sustain a national series, and they're going from Bath half marathon to UTS 50K because they want stones to go to Chamonix.
Yeah.
And all of the organisers in the middle are getting less runners, but also the runners that are going from the road half to UTS 50 are skipping years of building experience.
Yeah, and then race organisers wonder, why did 50% of the race DNF? Well, because they haven't cut their teeth learning how to be in these events. If you take Glencoe Skyline or Trophy Okima, if the vetting process wasn't super, super strict, can you imagine the carnage? It would be an absolute disaster. So these races that have real strict criteria, in a way, they initially create a stumbling block to entry anyway, because they are elitist. They are the best of the best. But that is something to aim for. And I think that's the point that you're making, is that if you wanted to do Trophy Okima, you could go to the Morn Skyline and run that as an introduction to what something that is a skyrunning race would feel like. Then you could have gone over to the UK and run in the Lake District, and then you might have gone to Glencoe and you'd have stepped. But now there's a shortcut. People are impatient. We live in this instant culture. When I'm working on a race, 10 years ago, I'd shoot the race, get back late, download the images, edit them the next day. They'd be ready in a few days. I'm getting messages now. Ian, have you got a photograph of the lead woman? And they passed me 1 minute ago. Now nobody wants to wait. And phones, the growth of the phone, I mean, it is something to celebrate and something to go like this with. I live with this permanently next to me. It's terrible, but it's my business. And everyone has one of these. Everyone is a content creator. Everyone can shoot a photo. Everyone can take a video. Whether they're any good or not, a lot of the time doesn't matter, because we're in a throwaway culture. And so what I've done with what I do is I make sure that my quality is top end. It's used on websites for years. It's not something that lasts as a reel 24 hours. It's not something that's in a story for 24 hours. Yes, I can do that, but that is not my business. I'll let other people do that. I'll stick to what I'm good at, what I want to create. And that's not diminishing anybody who's doing SoMe or content creation. There's a space for everybody. And now the sport requires it, because nobody wants to wait for anything. So yeah, there are huge changes, and small events, going back to your original point, are suffering. I think here in Norway is maybe one of the few exceptions. We don't really have a big world-class race. One that is, Tromsø was probably the one that garnered the most international competition, but getting to Tromsø was difficult. You'd have to fly from whatever country you're in into Oslo or to Bergen. Then you'd have to get another flight to Tromsø, and Norway is expensive. So if you came to do Tromsø Sky Race, it was a substantial amount of money, and people would pay that when Killian was the race director. But when Killian and Emily handed it over to the local team, the global community was like, oh, Killian not going to be there. Great route, but I really want Killian to be the race director. And so that race is now gone. They suffered from this, is that an absolutely amazing route created by one of the best skyrunners in the world, and it's disappeared because it just wasn't maintainable with local people. So,
But that is the Killian effect, though, isn't it? Like,
of course it is.
would hard rock be as popular if it wasn't for Killian loving hard rock and Salomon TV? Like, that definitely improved its visibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think hard rock is an outlier in the sense that it's a stunning course, very, very unique. It only has a limited number of participants, similar to Western states. It has this lottery procedure, and of course, if we go, let's say, pre-Killian, it probably always had its maximum number of runners, and there wasn't this global appeal to hard rock. Carl Meltzer, co-host of my podcast, ran hard rock. He's going to kill me. I'm going to get this wrong, but I think 6 times, and he won it countless times. But like he said to me, I wouldn't win it now. And I don't mean that from the point of view that because he's older. I mean, if he went back in time and we had the start lines that we have now, Carl would not win. No disrespect to Carl. And Carl doesn't mean any disrespect to himself, but it's changed. Hard rock is now this very, very small race with 3 or 4 amazing men, 3 or 4 amazing women racing, and we all get crazy about it. And there's a lot of me that feels a bit annoyed by that, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that we have this wonderful thing that a lot of people want to do. I want to see the showdown. I don't want to see them restrict the top men to be 3 people. Bring 20. Put Killian, put Francois, put Jim Wormsley, put Hayden Hawkes, put them all. Let's have like this real proper smackdown. But that would be fantastic. I would love that. So I get a little bit frustrated sometimes by hard rock in that, yeah, it's this amazing event, amazing course. Killian loves it because it's low profile. It's exactly the type of event that he loves. There's a reason why he lives in Norway. Nobody gives a shit who he is in Norway. He can walk around Romsdal and nobody will ask him for his autograph. Nobody will take a selfie. If he goes to Chamonix, no, he cannot move.
No chance.
No. So there is the Killian effect. And there's only a few people that have that. Courtney, Killian, Anton Kuprichka, immediately recognizable stars of the sport. And what would be interesting is if you took a high street in Chamonix, and if you had 2 cafes opposite each other, and you sat Courtney Dauwalter on the edge on one and Katie Scheid on the edge of the other. No disrespect to Katie, if you listen to this, people probably would not notice Katie because Katie's quite low profile. She's arguably one of the best ultra runners in the world. She is comparable with Courtney. But Courtney has the Salomon PR machine, the exposure, there's so many elements that make Courtney who she is. Whereas Katie's just a damn good runner who keeps a relatively low profile. And now runners are having to learn this. There is a change. You can be an awesome runner, but you also need to be an awesome content creator. You also need to have a personality. You have to go and do a lot of work outside training and racing. And that's a big change in the sport. If you think way back to like you said, until you started following my podcast, you couldn't speak to these people. You didn't know what they were thinking. You didn't really know who they are. So you could arguably say that I'm to blame and Brian Powell is to blame for where we are now. We're the ones that started to want the exposure, increase the exposure. And it's doing this. And I
there was an absolute lack of it, though. But think about
yes. Now
there was nothing. Yeah, exactly. It's totally flipped on its head. But think about your segment where Frosty used to come on. When else would you have heard Frosty even speak? You would have seen a couple of Salomon videos per year, something like that. But then we were getting the exposure from her being on your podcast and you following the races. So
yeah,
that was
Karl
great
Meltzer.
and that was good. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I mean, Karl Meltzer is arguably one of the greatest ultra runners ever. Anybody who has won as many 100-mile races as he has won and run 100-mile races, he's a legend of the sport. And still, in the UK, how many people would know Karl Meltzer? It was only via my podcast that people really got introduced to who Karl was. And equally, and I've always said this, I've always used Luis Alberto Hernando as an example. Okay? For me, one of the greatest runners ever. Absolutely incredible skyrunner. Never quite made the top mark in ultra because I think the sub 80 kilometer distance was his distance. But whenever Luis Alberto and Killian were on the start line, you knew there was going to be a smackdown. And Marco de Gasperi. Those three, it was, okay, get the popcorn. This one's going to be incredible. Go to America and ask them who Luis Alberto is. Ask them who Marco de Gasperi is. They will not have a clue. They'll only know Killian. And even then, not everyone will know Killian. America is very American. Whereas Europe is this whole big melting pot where we know the American runners, but it doesn't work the other way around.
That's a good opportunity to maybe talk a little bit more about this. One of the things that I've kind of see is as sport has grown, the American media side has just exploded, and the American outlets are happy to talk about the global scene, as in the global races, the things where, let's say, Cape Town, these types of races, not everything nationally or any of these types of things, but I guess what I'm trying to get to is the UK outlets, as one example, have been happy to just talk about national stuff and not expand out to talk globally and talk about the sport as it's globalized. So we're left in a situation where the sport grows. We've got all of these new runners and all of the media talk is from an American perspective. And it doesn't sit well. It doesn't sit well with me. That's actually why I started Trail Talk, because I thought, well, I think you're more English speaking Europeans should be talking more about this, because I love the American scene and the races, and I've lived there and I've raced there, but it's very different than Europe. Just like the UK is very different than France and Italy, like skyrunning in Italy compared to fell running, and then trail running, even trail running in the East Coast compared to the West Coast of America is very different.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about how the media landscape has changed.
I mean, it's changed a considerable amount. So let me talk about it from a Talk Ultra perspective to start with, because you've asked me, like, your last podcast was in September. Why is that? And it's super, super complex, the reasons why. Two of the key reasons is when I started the podcast, I was growing in this sport. I was growing with the sport, and I was documenting literally as it happened. I was learning at the same time as I was talking. And the bit that makes money, the photography, the writing, grew. And now, thankfully, I consider myself one of the key documenters of the sport. And that side of things puts a massive demand on my time. I travel to something like 30 to 40 races in 1 year. Sometimes I'm 1 month at a time on the road, maybe even longer. I'm traveling time zones, continents, countries, and trying to fit a podcast in is just, it becomes so difficult. And whereas what I would do was I'd take recording kit with me and say when a race had finished, I'd send a ping SMS to somebody. Hey, do you want a 30-minute chat? Sometimes I just don't have the time or the energy. If I get to the end day after a race, I'm just like vegetative sometimes. You just need space, reset, because the next weekend I'm going somewhere else. So that's one of the reasons why Tour Culture didn't exist. And plus, I just got fed up of Courtney wins Western States, and then the next day I'd see 30 podcasts. And I just think, what do I have to contribute to this? I don't have anything to contribute. And people would say to me, yeah, but you would interview it in your way. Yeah, but when you just saturate the market with a whole set of podcasts, that doesn't interest me. Maybe somebody might say, oh, well, you just don't like the competition. No, I think it's fantastic that the sport has grown. 30 different podcasts want to and have the time to interview Courtney, for example. That's great. But if each of those podcasts are getting 1,000 listens or 2,000 listens, we're just really messing the audience. My podcast would get 30,000 downloads, give or take. And even now, when I do a podcast, hardcore audience, it will still get like immediately 12,000, 15,000 downloads because
it's on auto. It's on auto downloading.
Exactly. Yeah. So Ian's done a podcast. Now, I don't know who's listening to them. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're just downloading. There can be too much sometimes, and you don't know where to look. And I think one of the advantages that I have is that people do know me and know me from the sport from way back in 2010, 2011. And so if I'm putting out some content, then it does give it a little bit more credibility and people will take a little bit more notice. So there's that side of things. But then, as you say, post 2020, there's been so much. And I can't even keep track of who is doing what. I think probably one of the most prominent names in the sport now for podcasts and related material is probably Dylan Bowman. He's had a very concerted effort in the last, let's say, 3 years to build that side of the sport. And I think he has probably become he's probably the Tour Culture now. When I was the one in 2014, 2015, probably Dylan and what he's doing is the equivalent now. But there are a lot of other just under the surface, like, running single track. And I mean, I can't even name them. There's so many. But like you say, that they are a lot of the time very American. I see the odd UK podcast. I mean, they're about, and they do try and diversify with who they interview. But, if you're talking about a fell race, Americans will not have a clue what you're talking about. You have to bring it on their level. Equally, I think you can talk about Western States, hard rock, and Europeans understand exactly what you're talking about. So I think the Americans tend to be quite, but what's happening in America? And like you'll hear somebody say, oh, that trail was super technical. I'll say,
did you use your hands?
Yeah, that was douche grade. That was, 3 rocks on the trail does not make this a technical race. Come to Europe. I can show you some technical races. And of course, the history with UTMB. How many times did American males come to UTMB? They were the pinnacle of the sport and just get the backsides dealt to them. The women fared much, much better. If we look at Rory Bosio and Nikki Kimball, they were pioneering the way at UTMB, but the men, no. It took the men a long time to learn. And I think Jason Schlab got very, very close. Obviously, Jim. But even Jim realized, if I want to win this race, I need to come and move to France, spend June, July, April, May, June, July in the mountains with poles and learn how to do this part of the sport. So, I think going back to what you're saying, there might be a lot of American-centric commentary, but I don't think it's necessarily bad. I think Dylan does a lot to try and cover world events, and I think there's sometimes things that an American podcast host will just not understand about a UK race or a skyrunning race. You know, they unless they've been put at Trophy Okima hanging onto a ledge with a risk of dying, they don't fully know what a technical race is until they've experienced it.
On one of our shows, I have a co-host, Wen. He's a pro trail runner with Hoka. And I always say to Ricky, if we ever have to talk about the news on the show, it's not going to be a good show because everyone else is just talking about the news. I don't want to talk about the news. We need to just be talking freely about things in the sport. And that's what I think we're lacking from not having Talk Ultra on the scene, not for the news reporting, but just the perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, maybe this might be the catalyst for me to have a resurgence, but I mean, it would never be anything like it was before. I mean, I've had good intentions to bring it back, and then life just gets in the way. You know, people have sent me an audio clip saying, I'm really sorry, guys. You know, this podcast has been a long time coming, but the next one will be much quicker. And then they'll say, it took you 6 months. It took you 6 months. But the intentions were there. But maybe I ping Carl and we just have a 2-hour chat, just waffling. Two old men, you know, sort of saying, oh, it used to be really great, didn't it? It used to be really good, you know. Because Carl, I love Carl, but he's very opinionated. And he's a little bit like Marmite. You know, some people love Carl's comments, some people hate Carl's, but that's good. I like people who have an opinion. You don't have to agree with, you're entitled to an opinion. You're allowed to have an opinion. It's like going back to the race entry prices. Too expensive, don't enter. Go somewhere else. If you want to run that trail, go on Saturday when there's nobody else there. But if you want to do it with 1,000 people in front of you and have safety and support and pay the price, or don't do it.
All right, let's change things up a little bit. I want to talk to you about the UTMB and how big the World Series has become, and throwing into the mix. Remember the heyday of the Ultra Trail World Tour and how cool that was, and now we've got the World Trail Majors, which is almost like trying to be what that was. But the sport has moved on so far that that's not competition for anything else that exists. That's more like a series of holiday races now.
Yeah.
I'd love to know your opinion on UTMB or by UTMB.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's say start with World Trail Majors. So I think World Trail Majors came about as there is an alternative to the by UTMB. Okay. And what they wanted to do was create a circuit that sort of kind of echoes Ultra Trail World Tour, the UTMB circuit, but not be this big machine. And so, like, you know, you have Centurion in the UK, Trans Gran Canaria, which is probably one of the biggest events, and they have, is it 5 races in total or 6 races? So they've created this like little mini series, and you can be the world champion of the World Trail Majors, which is great. It offers an alternative, but nobody compete with what UTMB are doing, and everybody is either benefiting or suffering. And I very much sit on the fence. You know, I work on some UTMB events, so this year I will go to Mozart 100, Cat 100 in Austria, Kulamanen in Sweden. Last year I went to Mute in South Africa, and the races that I've just mentioned. There's a part of me that thinks, you know, this is great. I'm working on races that I wouldn't have worked on in the past, but they also still have the element of what I love about the sport, and that is still relatively low key. And I can see people now throwing their phones against a wall. What are you on about, low key? It's UTMB. If you come to Kullamarden in Sweden, there's no media. There's no camera runners. There's no people on the trail. It's me and a couple of other media guys. It's still a low-key, small event. Yes, there's 2,000 people running in the weekend, but it's still a small event. Cat 100 in Austria, still a relatively small event. You know, there's a small media team, and other than that, there is no real world media. So there is that part of it. But when you have this pinnacle of UTMB, Chamonix, that week, and, you know, I love and hate it. Absolutely love and hate it. I love to see that many people in one place, all loving the same thing that I love. But at the same time, I hate being around that many people. I hate working on UTMB now. You know, there's no pleasure. There's no joy. There's camera runners everywhere. There's mobile phones everywhere. The live coverage means that the top men and women have a mountain bike in front of them or a runner behind them. And that's just something that I have to accept, that I may be in the fortunate position that because I've been in the sport so long and that I have the choice, I don't need to go to Chamonix for UTMB week. Now, I bumped into you in the street, didn't I, a couple of years ago?
Yeah.
And I think from sort of 2018 through to around about 23, I was at UTMB every year because I was working for Adidas. And that worked for me because I was just following one brand. So I didn't have to worry about the whole race. I would just follow an athlete or several athletes, and that was my job. And that worked and that fitted into me. But going to UTMB now and trying to photograph the event, I'd like to photograph it and document it from the outside, you know, sort of a little bit of a warts on all about this is the craziness of the week, and not necessarily try and follow the racing because it becomes chaotic. But I can see how that is really appealing to everyday people who aspire to this holy grail. And we have a world championships in trail running, but is it the world championships? Is Chamonix the world championships? Certainly there is this real dialogue and fight between, you know, we have a world championships, but really we don't get the best of the best at the world championships because Chamonix pulls them. And then the knock-on effect is the by UTMB, which is now global. Is it good for the sport? Yes. Is it bad for the sport? Maybe. It's I think about the UK. Okay. And if we go back a few years, there was no UTMB races. You know, the biggest race in the UK was probably Lakeland 100. Snowdonia was gaining profile because it's a really damn hard course. You had Arc of Attrition on the southwest coast, and then there'd be some other events. UTMB comes in, overtakes Snowdonia, and it elevates in profile. Not only elevates the size of the race, but the quality of runners that were taking part. Because we have to accept that these events all filter to the big dance in Chamonix. If there are 70 plus events around the world, these events start to become really, really popular for people who want to toe the line at OCC or CCC or UTMB. So if I'm not quite up to star status, if I can't keep up with Courtney Dauwalter and Katie Scheid and these other top runners, where do I go that I can get on the podium? Oh, I know. I'll go to Singapore and I'll do the whatever 100-miler so that I can get on the podium, which will get me to Chamonix. Is that a good thing? I think it's quite nice that people can have this opportunity to achieve their dream of being in Chamonix. now, whenever we talk about this stuff, we have to talk about ecology. Is it okay that people are traveling to China to go and get a race so that they maybe can get on the podium at UTMB? No, probably not. But I can't criticize anybody because my job is about traveling around the world photographing races. And this is the problem that we have at the moment. And even the top runners who really want to talk about ecology and environmental impact, they still themselves have to travel around to get to races. Now, yes, a lot of them are making very conscious decisions to travel less and maybe do some more local races. So in some respects, that's quite a good thing. Damien Hall, nice example. Damien now races are so much in the UK because he doesn't want to travel. Like he will say himself, he has to contradict himself because if he wants to go to the Barclay, he has to travel. And this creates this real dilemma for somebody who wants to be very vocal about environmental impact, is that you sometimes have to swallow your own pride to still do what you want to do. And I think the UTMB circuit has been seen as this, well, you're just encouraging people to travel. For sure, some people will maybe want to see different races in different countries. I don't think we needed UTMB to do that. One of the things that I've always loved was, I want to go to the Alps and experience this. I want to go to France and go to this. I want to go to Italy to experience that. I want to go to Spain and do that. So UTMB has maybe made it more visible and more, let's say, easier. But I still think the way that the thinking for them is that if you have 4 races in France, this is 4 opportunities for you to get stones for the big dance. In Spain, you can race locally, if you're Spanish, to get stones. If you're in China, you can race locally to get stones. And, the American market was complaining, saying, we have to travel to Europe. So there was almost this contradiction is, we're fed up of UTMB adding races, but hey, you've not added any in North America. So it means that if I want to try and be on the UTMB start line, I have to travel to France, Italy, Spain, Germany to get my stones. Is it going to change? No, I don't think so. I do wonder how long UTMB can keep the growth going, and will there be at some point some huge backlash? Will there be a problem? I'm going to refer back to Aurea events. I considered Aurea as one of the benchmark race event organizers. The cease trading this last week is a real shock because I thought, well, these guys are professional. These guys know what they're doing. And it makes me think that, when UTMB have got circa 70 races around the world, I mean, they are not the race organizers. The way that they do this is they go into an already existing event that has growth to be to 2,000, 3,000 people. And they may buy the race and keep the core race organizing team in place, or it might become a franchise. And also you have to remember that some of the races are Ironman, some of the races are Poletti. So there is a structure within a structure. And, a good example is Transvulcania became a UTMB, but it was a franchise. And they decided, no, it's not for us. They're no longer a UTMB. So I don't know what percentage of races around the world are franchises and what races are owned. But if I was a financial advisor or a real businessman, I'd be really interested to look at the figures of globally how much UTMB are in the red, because I have to assume that they are in the red, not in the black. With the amount that they've been spending, they probably have some really huge business plan. But this then goes back to the conversation about race entries. Is if Ironman UTMB have spent, let's just say 100 million. I have no idea how much they've spent, but let's say they've spent 100 million. and the 80 million in the red, you've got a long way to go before you're even at zero. And that's the knock-on effect. And people will choose with the entry fees and with the race subscriptions. And like I said, what I'm seeing is no UTMB race, as far as I know, is struggling for entries. You know, it seems to me that the running community, they're very vocal about not liking it, but they keep entering.
Yeah, we have a community built around the podcast, and the conversation around stones always centers around, look, I'm after stones until I get the race in Chamonix, and then I'll probably race other things. But it is zero focus that I need to get to Chamonix to experience the finale. Whereas I have raced there 4 times, and I've done a couple of UTMB races since, but not for stones, just because, you know, I was in Sydney,
You want to do
Blue
them.
Mountains were there. I wanted to see what UTA was like. I wanted to see what Kosciuszko was like, and it was an opportunity to go there. I won't go back to Kosciuszko this year because I went and experienced it and know what's on offer. But everyone that has not experienced the finale has an infatuation with getting stones, and that's why the UTMB races sell out across the board. One thing that I wanted to say, one of the more recent UTMB race announcements in America, actually, the Utah one, was it in Snow Bowl or something like this?
Snowbird.
There's only two, not Snowbird, no, only 2 distances. And I think it was like a 25 and a 50.
Okay.
Which I thought was an interesting way to launch a new event. And I'm just wondering, is that something that we see with UTMB going forward, where they...
No, I don't think so. I mean, I definitely don't know. But I think you have to remember that America is very unique in the sense that we think about Europe and European trails, and we generally think we can run anywhere. There's not really anything off limits. Private land, of course. Whereas in America, it is completely the opposite. You can't run anywhere unless you're told you can run there. So I know with... God, the name's gone from my head. We had the Sky Race in close to Bozeman, organised by Mike Wolf and Mike
the Rut.
Foot. The Rut. Okay. So the Rut could happen because it was all on private land. The whole race took place on private land, and it was the ski resort. So we could go on the ridges and on the mountain because the ski resort owned them. But if you go outside of the ski resort, even if there's a beautiful ridge in front of you, you can't just go on it. It's trespassing. It's illegal. So it would I would imagine that with the Utah example that you're talking, is that they can't get a course longer at the moment. And maybe their thinking is if they can put on a 25 and a 50K, prove that it's okay, prove that they are responsible, prove that they are good, somewhere down the line, they may have the option to have an 80K, 100K. But this is the interesting dynamic with US races and European races, is that land permissions in America are much, much harder to come by. And this is why Western states has a restriction on how many can take place, at least for the first 60 miles of the course. And ironically, once they get past 60 miles, you can have a pacer and you suddenly double the amount of people on the course. But it's all about land permissions and what can and what cannot happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. UTMB and ITRA split in 2021. And of course, UTMB created ITRA, created the points, or the ITRA score, which is now a version of that is now the UTMB index. What's your opinion on there being a lack of a unified index across the sport?
This is a conversation that's been going on for years. You know, I mean, certain things come under athletics. Skyrunning came under the IAU, which is the climbing, because of the scrambling sections. Then you've got the world mounting, all these separate bodies. And there's been a lot of conversation about we need one unifying body. And I think that's really what ITRA tried to do. And unfortunately, the connections with ITRA and UTMB and the Palettes was all a little bit too close, and people thought, no, we're not having that. And so we're still in this mess. How do we come out of that mess? I don't really know. I mean, I'd love to see some sort of one global name, let's call it Tantrums. I'm looking at your screen and I've just picked up the word Tantrums. So let's call it Tantrums, and Tantrums, underneath Tantrums, you have Skyrunning, trail running, but this one body with a set of rules, like one ring to rule them all. But then people would still complain and say, but that doesn't apply to this. That doesn't apply to that. And again, then we'll lead to the conversation about doping and how do we control doping and WADA. And, we had the ITRA medical profile, which was really as useful as a chocolate teapot.
Quartz.
Yeah, it didn't mean anything. It was a nice gesture. It was kind of like a step in the right direction. But no, I mean, it didn't mean anything. Unless you have WADA testing in and out of competition, there is no real drug control in trail mounting and ultra running. I mean, Skyrunning would arguably chip in here and say, we've been doing drug testing way back. And they have. When we had the finals in Limone, WADA was present, and the top 3 men and women would be drug tested, and then there would be some random tests. Now, admittedly, let's just say out of 400 runners, we'd only test 15 people, but it's better than nothing. And at least if you're testing the podium, like what we had at UTMB last year, when somebody is found positive, at least the person who should have won or should have been second or should have been third gets the position that they should have had. It's not perfect, but I think if WADA and drug testing becomes something that we really, really need in the sport, people really will start complaining about race entry prices, because that money has to come from somewhere, and WADA is expensive. Seriously expensive. So, if people are going to shout out, we've got to have drug testing. Okay, well, UTMB is now €550 instead of €450. Now, let's forget drug testing. This is the dilemma that we have in the sport.
Do you think that if we fast forward 10, 12, 15 years, that really we're just living through the teething problems, that in 2035 we're going to have a unified system under a governing body with
I have no idea.
Competition doping?
You know what? I would say in the last 3 or 4 years, with the way the sport has gone, there's times when I start to feel old. I mean, I'm getting old, but I start to feel old. And I remember my dad and my granddad before me getting to a point in their life that were saying, you know what, I'm glad I'm at the age I'm at. And I found myself sort of saying, I'm glad I'm at the age I'm at, because I'm like really worried about where we will be in 10 years' time. I'm really worried about where we will be in 15 years' time. And I don't have any answers or solutions, but I just feel as though we're doing this and I can't see where we're going. The one thing I loved about skyrunning is when I was on the trail, I could see the summit and I would aim for the summit. I don't feel as though we have a summit at the moment. I feel we're just constantly climbing, but we don't know what it is we're aiming for. And that's dangerous, because if we don't know what we're aiming for, we run the risk of getting it wrong and creating some really bad damage, which will set everything back and then we'll need a reset. And arguably, you can say COVID was the last reset. What will be the next reset? You know, maybe it doesn't need a pandemic. Maybe it's UTMB growing so much that it all falls apart. And then we're left with this wasteland of 70 races that don't exist anymore. I'm not saying that that's going to happen. I don't think it will. But I never thought Aurea Events would cease trading. I didn't think the Skyrunner World Series would change from what it was to what it is now. Things change, and we should embrace the change. And I think the important thing is the key people in the sport, the people that in many ways can lead the direction, they need to be vocal. And, you know, and I say this, when Killian speaks, people listen. When Dylan Bowman is speaking, people listen. And when Courtney says something, people will go, oh yeah, I never thought of that. And Killian wrote an article just recently about some of these question marks. He was talking about, you know, is pacing okay? Because he's okay. He's in a real advantage that he can have paces, but the average Joe can't. Is that fair? Is it okay that he has a crew? The average Joe can't, because if you were traveling to America to run Western States, you know, would you take 4 people with you and pay for them and pay their flights and pay for the hotels so that they could give you a vest at mile 20 and a vest at mile 40?
Absolutely not.
Exactly. Killian can. Is that fair? And I love the fact that Killian puts that mirror on himself and says, you know, when I started this sport, I was just like you. I was nobody. Okay, incredible set of lungs, incredible set of legs, an amazing athlete. But he was where we all were when we started running. And I like the fact that these key people question what they are doing, because that will form what happens in the future. You know, Zach Miller and some of the PTRA was questioning, you know, should UTMB be what UTMB is? And of course, that email exchange came out in the public and it caused huge debate. But there was a lot of good that come out of that, because it made UTMB look and go, oh shit, we better address some of these points. And so the communications with the PTRA got together. They had meetings. If you're pregnant, you can defer your entry. If you are made redundant, you can approach the race and ask them for a deferral. These are all things that step away from prominent people in the sport saying that it's not okay that you do this. And we need more of that. We need people saying, this is great, this is not so great. Love this, don't like that. And of course, that's not to say that anybody is right or wrong. Debate comes from that, and debate is how change happens so that the majority of people are happy. I've got a call in 9 minutes, so we need to wind it up.
Yeah. And on that point, it brings it back to the earlier point, how important it is that important and influential people in the sport help to shape it, whether it be a race director in England or an elite athlete that has the experience to see how the sport has gone and what needs to be developed better. So yeah, no, I totally agree on that. Let's wrap it up on one of my favorite subjects. I know one of your favorite subjects.
I'm laughing here because you said to me, how long have we got? And I said, we're good for an hour. We're coming up for 2 hours of boring people to death.
Well, I've enjoyed it.
I told you, if you get me talking, I can't stop.
Well, my favorite podcasts are the ones where I don't do much talking, so we're all good. Killian Jornet. Will we ever see another Killian?
Will we ever see another Killian? Yes. Yeah. I think so. I think if you ask me the question, and this is a question that's been asked me several times, is will we see another Scott Jurek who won Western States 7 times? No. because I think the sport has changed so much that you can't have one athlete going back to the same event and winning it 7 times. Maybe at 7 points in a career, but even then, it still would be very, very hard because the competition has changed so much that back in the day, Scott was a dirtbag runner and a really good runner that was just better than everybody else. Now, you look at the play field. You've got to be on your A game to win a race now. And this is why runners need to race less. You can't go from one race to the next race to the next race and be winning.
Killian could.
What Killian could, because he is one of the freaks in the sport, in that he's brilliant at CurraNZ and brilliant at 100 miles. You name other athletes that have that range, and I think this is your point: is there another one somewhere? My gut feeling is, of course there is. We just don't know if they know it, and maybe they've not been born yet. But if I look at, one of the things I love about living in Norway is sport is just in people's DNA. Everybody loves sport here. From kids at 3 skiing out of school on Nordic skis to playing in the playground, no matter what the weather, you just wear the clothes that make it okay. And they nurture the best sports people in the world. Think about the sport at the moment. And okay, I'm going to lean towards mountain skyrunning. John Alban lives here. Henrietta, his wife, is Norwegian. Mimi Kotka, Ida Nielsen, Emily Forsberg. Killian lives in Norway. Petter Engdahl. I mean, I can just list Norwegian or Swedish Scandinavian athletes who either are born or live in Norway, and the pool is incredible. Absolutely incredible. So, is there another Killian? Of course there is. There's got to be somewhere. There's got to be. Can we find them? That's the question, and maybe they're in a different sport. Killian started as a ski mountaineer, and he started running because he couldn't ski. And one of his favorite quotes is, "I would never be running if I could be skiing." So, running for Killian is still the sport that he does when he can't ski. And now, of course, he's creative and he's a superb athlete, and he's extended that to incredible mountain adventures. But even he now wants to race less, but he's changed that again this year. He's going back to all the classics that made him who he is. He's going back to CurraNZ. He's going to Zagama. He's going to race Western States because it doesn't really suit him. And therefore, that is the challenge. Can he to run a fast 100 miler with no mountains? Because if you put mountains in there, he'd probably drop everybody and they wouldn't even come close. But can he beat a really good runner at Western States? That's what keeps him alive. And I love the fact that if he comes third, he'll smile and say, "I gave it a shot." He's got nothing to prove. The best in the world. Absolutely. In any sport.
Love a motivated Killian, and he just thrives on competition. So, all right, Ian, thanks so much for your time. That has been...
You're welcome. Yeah, you're sort of like twisting my arm that I have to message Carl and say, "Carl, let's do a podcast." I've just been on a podcast and I've been reminded that I haven't done one for a very long time.
Just like a Glencoe, like a reunion episode. Drop a couple of reunion episodes every year. That would.
Yeah, a Glencoe episode from Glencoe would be the thing.
Yeah, do that.
On the Anakiga, recording people as they come across. Well, look, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, and folks who are listening. I hope I didn't waffle too much. I asked her not to give me any questions in advance, not give me any subject matter, because I think I prefer just to wing it and see where the direction takes, which does mean that I might jump around a little bit. It's been a thought-provoking chat, one that I think there's probably a lot of things that I've been thinking about internally that I haven't really vocalized because I've not been doing a podcast. So it's quite nice that you've sort of like pulled those words out of me. And I'd be interested to see what people's feedback is.